Every word spoken and every action taken leaves a silver echo that resonates through the digital halls of our shared history. We follow these echoes to find the lessons and the legacies that still matter to us today. Subscribe now and listen to the stories that refuse to fade.
Didn't know I had a copy of everything. That's the part nobody thinks about when they're busy humiliating someone. They forget that the person standing there, quietly, might already know exactly how this ends. My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a land surveyor in northern Ontario, out in the bush, mostly, measuring things other people would eventually build on. It's not glamorous work. You come home dirty. Your back hurts by the time you're 50. Your hands get rough and your truck always smells like mud and coffee. But I was good at it and I was honest, and I never once borrowed money I didn't intend to pay back. I tell you this because it matters. It matters because my brother spent most of our adult lives making me feel like I had nothing to show for myself. His name is Douglas. He's 4 years younger than me, which somehow translated, in his mind, into being a generation ahead. He married into money early. His wife, Sandra, came from a family in Mississauga that had done well in commercial real estate. And after that, Douglas stopped being the kid who used to follow me around the lake at our parents' cottage and started being someone I barely recognized. Sharp clothes, a house in Oakville. A leased BMW he traded in every 3 years. He talked about square footage the way other men talked about hockey scores. I didn't begrudge him any of it. Honestly. I was happy for him, at first. The trouble started, really, after our father died. Dad passed in the spring of 2019. He was 81 years old and had lived a full life. A good man, a quiet man, the kind of man who fixed things himself and never raised his voice. He left behind a cottage on Lake Temagami that had been in our family since 1967. 3 acres of rocky Canadian shield, a dock that needed work every other year, a wood stove that heated the whole main room in October. It wasn't worth much in the grand scheme of things. Maybe $400,000 on a good day. But it was ours. It was where we grew up. Dad's will split everything equally between Douglas and me. The cottage was listed jointly, which meant, in practical terms, that we both had to agree on what to do with it. Douglas wanted to sell immediately. His reasoning was efficient, as his reasoning always was. The property taxes were climbing. Neither of us lived close enough to use it regularly. A developer had already been sniffing around that stretch of the lake. I said no. I said I wanted to keep it for a few years at least. I said our mother wasn't even gone yet, and maybe we could wait until we knew what she wanted. That was the beginning of the end of Douglas and me. Our mother, Ruth, was still alive then, 78, sharp as a tack, living in the same house in Sudbury where we'd both grown up. She had a small pension, her savings, and a portfolio of investments that my father had been quietly building since the 1970s. None of us knew exactly how much was in it. Dad had been private about money in the way that generation often was. You didn't talk about it at the dinner table. You just made sure your family was taken care of. What I knew, what Douglas apparently never thought to ask about, was that I had been helping Mum with her finances for the past 6 years. Not because I inserted myself. Because she asked me to. After Dad got sick, she needed someone to sit with her at the bank, help her understand the statements, make sure nothing was falling through the cracks. Douglas was too busy. Sandra thought it was beneath him, though she'd never have said it in those words. So I drove up to Sudbury. Every couple of months, I'd make the trip. We'd have dinner, go through our papers, talk. And over those 6 years, I came to understand exactly what my mother had, and exactly what she intended to do with it. But I didn't tell Douglas any of that. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't strategy, not at first. I just knew that the moment Douglas understood the full picture, everything would change, and not for the better. So I kept helping Mum quietly, and I let Douglas assume what he'd always assumed, that I was the brother who hadn't amounted to much. The one who still drove an F-150 and owned a modest house in Timmins. The one who could afford to be sentimental about a cottage because he didn't have real assets to worry about. He wasn't shy about saying so either. Not directly. Douglas never did anything directly. But at family dinners, the one Sandra hosted in Oakville, where the wine cost more than my weekly groceries and everyone was careful about which fork they used. I would catch it in the way he spoke to me, or the way he didn't speak to me. The way he'd redirect a conversation to his renovation, his investment property in Collingwood, his son's acceptance to Queens. Their son, my nephew, is named Trent. He's 28. He's a good-looking kid with his mother's cheekbones and his father's certainty, and he had, by that point, absorbed every one of Douglas's opinions about me without question. I was Uncle Walter, who drove a truck and worked outside, and didn't understand the value of leveraging equity. I could see it in the way he looked through me at his dinners. I kept showing up anyway, for Mum. Always for Mum. The moment things broke open completely was a Sunday in March 2 years ago. Mum had been declining, not dramatically. She was still herself, still sharp. But she was 81 by then, and the winters were getting harder, and she'd mentioned more than once that she was thinking about what came next. Douglas had started calling her more frequently. I noticed it because Mum mentioned it, not because I was keeping score. Douglas keeps asking about the financial advisor's name, she told me on the phone one night. I don't know why he needs it. I knew why he needed it. The Sunday I'm talking about, Douglas and Sandra drove up to Sudbury. They took Trent with them. They told Mum they wanted to have a family lunch, that it had been too long, that they missed her. Mum called me the night before, excited. She asked if I was coming. I said of course. I drove 4 hours. Got there by 11 in the morning. Mum answered the door in her good blouse, the blue one she wore when she wanted to look nice for company. Douglas arrived at noon with Sandra and Trent. We sat down for lunch. Mum had made her roast chicken, the one she'd been making since we were kids, with the rosemary and the potatoes that got crispy at the edges. We talked about nothing for a while. The drive. The weather. Trent's new job at a firm downtown. Then, over dessert, Mum's butter tarts, which she'd also made from scratch. Douglas set down his fork and said he wanted to discuss something important. He said Mum's house was getting to be a lot for her to manage. He said the neighborhood had changed. He said he and Sandra had been talking, and they thought it made the most sense for Mum to sell the Sudbury house, use the proceeds to move somewhere with more support, and let them help her manage the transition. Mum looked at him over her butter tart. She said, "What kind of transition did you have in mind, Douglas?" He said there was a retirement community in Burlington, close to them. Sandra had already toured it. It was very nice. Mum said, "Burlington." Sandra jumped in. She said it really was lovely. She'd taken photos. She pulled out her phone. I sat there. I didn't say anything yet. I was watching Mum's face. Mum looked at the photos. She handed the phone back. She said, "That's very thoughtful of you both." She said it the way she used to say it to us when we were children, and had done something that required correction, but she wasn't ready to correct it yet. Then she looked at me. I said, "Mum, what do you want?" She said, "I want to stay in my house." Douglas started to explain that it wasn't really sustainable financially long-term. I said, "Douglas." He stopped. I said, "She told you what she wants." That was when things shifted. You could feel it, the way you can feel the temperature drop before a storm. Douglas looked at me across the table, past Mum, past Sandra, directly at me. And something settled in his face that had probably been there a long time. He said, "Walter, with respect, this isn't really your decision." I said, "No, it's hers." He said, "You've been driving up here every few months and playing the devoted son routine, but at the end of the day, Sandra and I are in a position to actually help Mum make sound financial decisions. No offense. No offense." He said it like a period at the end of a sentence. Sandra was looking at the table. Trent was looking at his phone. I said, "What exactly do you think her financial situation looks like?" Douglas said, "I think it's manageable but not unlimited, and I think the house is an asset she's sitting on when she should be using it." I said, "Okay." He said, "I know you're attached to the house. I know you're attached to the cottage too, but we have to be realistic." I said, "Okay, Douglas. He looked at me like he was deciding whether I was agreeing with him or dismissing him. He went with agreeing. He said, "Good, then maybe we can all have a sensible conversation about this." Mom was quiet through all of it. She had finished her butter tart. She folded her napkin. I drove home to Timmins that evening, 4 hours back through the dark, the highway empty by the time I hit the north, the trees black on either side. I thought about my father. I thought about the way Douglas had said no offense, and meant something precise by it. I thought about my nephew looking at his phone. I called Mum the next morning. I asked her how she was feeling. She said, "I've been thinking." I said, "About Burlington?" She said, "About a lot of things." Then she asked me if I could come up again the following weekend. She said she wanted to go see her lawyer with me. She said there were some things she'd been putting off, and she didn't want to put them off anymore. I said I'd be there. I won't tell you every detail of what happened in that lawyer's office, because some of it belongs to Mum and not to me. But I'll tell you this. My mother was a woman who had spent her entire life making herself small in rooms where she felt she was supposed to be grateful. She had raised 2 sons, managed a household on a surveyor's income when Dad was starting out, gone back to work when we were teenagers, taken care of my father through 2 years of illness without a word of complaint. She had never once, in my living memory, demanded anything. What she had done, quietly and without telling anyone, was save. My father's investment portfolio, the one no one had ever asked about in detail, had grown to just over $1.2 million. The Sudbury house was fully paid off and assessed at just under $300,000. There was a small insurance policy, some bonds, a TFSA. Altogether, my mother had assets that Douglas, in his certainty, had never come close to imagining, and she had already decided what she wanted to do with them. The lawyer read back the changes she'd made. She'd redone her will once before, after Dad died. This time she was thorough. The house in Sudbury would go to me, on the condition that it remain in the family for a minimum of 10 years before any sale. The investment portfolio, minus specific bequests, would also come to me, as executor and as primary beneficiary. There was a sum set aside for Douglas, a fair sum, but not what he'd been expecting. She hadn't done it to punish him. I want to be clear about that. She'd done it because she trusted me, and because trust, she said, was the only inheritance that actually meant anything. I walked out of that office into a gray Sudbury afternoon, and I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment just breathing. I drove Mum home. She made tea. We sat at her kitchen table, and she told me about the rosebush in the backyard that she wanted to split in the spring, and whether I thought the Avistros needed replacing. We didn't talk about the will. There wasn't any need. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Douglas would find out in his own time, and that it would be difficult, and that we'd find some way through it because we were brothers, and Mum was still alive, and you don't burn everything down while your mother is still alive. I was wrong about that last part. At least the timing of it. The family gathering happened in July. Every year, Mum's side of the family did a reunion of sorts, rented a pavilion at a provincial park near Huntsville, brought food, sat around for an afternoon. It was the kind of thing that had happened my whole life. Cousins I only saw once a year, aunts who remembered when I was 8. That kind of afternoon. Douglas and Sandra came. Trent came. I drove down from Timmins with my daughter, Carolyn. She's 35, lives in Thunder Bay, made the trip to see Mum. We got there early and helped Mum set up her folding chair in the shade. I should tell you about the parking lot. We'd arrived in 2 cars. Carolyn had driven separately from the north end of the park. When I pulled in, Douglas's BMW was already there. He was standing by the trunk with Trent, unloading a cooler. Sandra was somewhere ahead of them. I waved. Douglas looked at me. He looked at my truck. He said something to Trent, and Trent laughed. I know what they were looking at. The truck is 10 years old. The back bumper has a dent from when I reversed into a hydropole in 2021. There's a crack in the rear window that I've been meaning to get fixed. It runs perfectly, but it looks like what it is. A working truck that belongs to a working man. I kept walking. Later, at one of the tables, Douglas ended up beside me while people were going to the lunch line. Mum was at the end of the table with her sister, talking about something. Trent was across the pavilion with some of the younger cousins. Douglas leaned over and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "We should talk about Mum's situation. I've spoken to a financial advisor friend of mine. There are some moves she should be making." I said, "She's already making them." He said, "Walter, I know you mean well, but this isn't really your area." I said, "Which area would that be?" He said, "Finance, planning. She needs someone who understands these things." He said it gently, the way you'd explain something to a child. "I'm not trying to take over. I just think she'd benefit from real guidance." Real guidance. Like what I offered was imaginary. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the lawyer's office. I thought about my mother's handwriting on the documents. I thought about 31 years of waking up at 5 in the morning and going out in temperatures that would stop your blood. I said, "I appreciate that, Douglas." He nodded, satisfied. Carolyn caught my eye from across the pavilion. She raised an eyebrow. I shook my head slightly. "Not yet." The afternoon went on. It was a good afternoon, actually. The kind that reminds you why you still show up to these things. Kids running around. The old cousins who remember Dad. Mum laughing at something her sister said, her face bright the way it got when she was genuinely happy. And then, near the end of the day, when people were starting to pack up, Douglas gathered a few of the older family members. His wife, 2 cousins who'd always deferred to him, Trent, and he started talking about Mom's house. Loudly enough that I could hear from where I was folding up a table. Loudly enough, I realized, that Mum could hear from her chair. He was explaining, in the tone of someone laying out a sensible plan, that Mum's situation needed to be addressed, that the Sudbury house was an underperforming asset, that the family had a responsibility, that sometimes the people we love couldn't make the best decisions for themselves, and it was up to those of us who understood these things to step in. He didn't look at me while he said it. That was deliberate. Mum set down her cup of tea. She stood up. She is a small woman, my mother, 5'2", has been her whole adult life. She was wearing her blue blouse again, the same one from the Sunday lunch in March. She walked over to where Douglas was standing. She said, "Douglas, I'd like you to stop." He looked at her. "Mum, I'm just," she said. "I know what you're doing, and I want you to stop." The cousins went quiet. Sandra looked at the ground. Trent looked at his phone and then put it in his pocket. Mum said, "I am 81 years old, and I have managed my own affairs since before you were born." "I don't need managing," Douglas said. "Nobody's trying to," she said. "I've seen my lawyer. It's been handled. There's nothing left to discuss." The quiet that followed was the particular kind of quiet that happens when everyone in a group realizes they've been watching something they weren't supposed to see. Douglas looked at me. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that my mother hadn't just said better. He said, "What does that mean? It's been handled." She said, "It means it's been handled, Douglas." That was all she said. He tried, over the next 20 minutes, with me, when Mum had moved away and the cousins had found somewhere else to be. He pulled me aside near the parking lot, and his voice had changed by then. The confidence was still there, but it was thinner, like ice in March. He asked me what was going on. He said he deserved to know. He said he was the one who had offered to help, who had done the research, who had Mum's best interests at heart. I said, "I know you believe that." He said, "Walter, what did you do?" I said, "You'll find out in time." He said, "Did she change her will?" I said, "That's between her and her lawyer." He said, "She wouldn't do that. She knows I'd been trying to help." I said, "Douglas, do you know what Mum's portfolio is actually worth?" He named a number. He was out by about $800,000. He stared at me. I said, "She's been building it since 1974. Dad put in the first contributions, but she kept adding to it after he died. Every year. She's quite good at it, actually." He kept staring. I said, "She knew what she had. She always knew. She just didn't tell you because she didn't think it was relevant. He said, "What does that mean, relevant?" I said, "I think you know what it means." I left him there in the parking lot. Carolyn was waiting by my truck. She'd heard enough. She said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "You could have said more." I said, "Mum said enough for both of us." Carolyn smiled at that. She looked like her grandmother when she smiled. I drove back up north that evening. The highway was quiet. The sun was low and orange over the trees by the time I hit the Perry Sound stretch, and the shield was doing what it always does in the late summer light, which is look like something that cannot be touched or moved or leveraged or sold, like something that was there before any of us arrived and will be there long after we're gone. I thought about my father, the way I often do when I'm on that stretch of road. He was a man who never explained himself. He just did what he believed was right and let it be what it was. He measured land for a living, same as I did. He knew the value of things that didn't announce themselves. I think about what he built. Not the money is just numbers, but the decades of quiet decisions, the consistent showing up, the choosing to do the right thing when the wrong thing would have been easier. He did all of that, and then he left it to my mother, who did the same, and between them, they built something real. Douglas found out the full terms of the will about 3 weeks later. Mom's lawyer sent the documentation. Douglas called me the same day. The conversation was short. He said he was considering his options. I said I hoped he'd think it through carefully. He said he felt blindsided. I said I was sorry he felt that way. He didn't come to Mom's birthday dinner in September. Sandra sent flowers. Trent didn't send anything, which I think surprised even Douglas, though he wouldn't have said so. Mum had a good birthday. We sat in her kitchen in Sudbury, Carolyn and me, and we had the roast chicken again, and the butter tarts, and Mum laughed until she teared up at something Carolyn said about a raccoon situation at her apartment in Thunder Bay. The kitchen was warm. The windows were fogged from the oven. Mum looked at me at one point, across the table, and she said, "You know what your father used to say?" I said, "Which part?" She said, "He used to say the best thing a man can do is show up and be quiet and do good work. He said the rest takes care of itself." I said, "He was right about that." She said, "He was right about a lot of things." We sat there a while longer. The butter tarts were the best she'd ever made, or maybe they just tasted that way. I'm not a man who needs much. I've got my work, my house, my daughter, my truck with the cracked rear window. I've got a lake in northern Ontario where my grandfather built a dock in 1967 and where the loons still come in the early morning. I've got my mother's trust, which is worth more than any number my brother ever tried to put on things. Douglas and I haven't spoken much since September. Maybe we will again, in time. Family is complicated the way that land is complicated, full of history, full of borders that were drawn before you arrived, full of things that look simple from a distance and turn out to be anything but. You survey it carefully. You do the work. You write it all down accurately, and you sign your name to it. That's all any of us can do, really. The cottage on Lake Temagami is still in the family. I went up for a week in October, just me and the wood stove in the cold mornings. Fixed 2 boards on the dock. Cleared the Avastros, left it the way my father would have left it. Better than I found it. Ready for whoever comes next. The loons had already gone south for the winter. But the lake was still there, and the trees, and the light on the water in the afternoon, and all of that was enough. More than enough. It always has been. I've thought a lot about what my mother said that afternoon at the kitchen table in Sudbury. Not the part about the will, not the lawyer, not any of the numbers. Just that one thing she repeated from my father. Show up, be quiet, do good work. The rest takes care of itself. I used to think that was just something people said. The kind of thing you put on a plaque and hang in a garage. But I'm 63 now, and I've watched enough lives unfold around me to understand it isn't a saying at all. It's a description of how things actually work. Douglas spent years building an image of himself as the capable one. The one who understood money, who made sound decisions, Go had arrived somewhere the rest of us hadn't. And in doing that, in performing competence instead of practicing it, he stopped paying attention to what was actually happening around him. He didn't know what Mum's portfolio was worth because he'd already decided she needed managing. He didn't know she'd been making careful financial decisions for 50 years because he'd stopped listening to her a long time ago. He walked into that family reunion with a plan, and he couldn't see, not even slightly, that the ground had already shifted under his feet. That's what happens when you confuse the appearance of something for the thing itself. You stop looking. And the moment you stop looking is the moment you stop understanding what's real. My mother understood something that took me a long time to learn as well, that trust is built in ordinary moments, not grand ones. It's built on 4-hour drives through the dark, and sitting at a kitchen table going through bank statements, and showing up when it's inconvenient, and doing it again the following month. It's not dramatic. Nobody's watching. There's nothing to post about it. You just do it because it's the right thing to do, and the person in front of you matters to you. That's the only kind of integrity that holds up over time. The kind nobody sees you performing. I think about Trent, my nephew, and I don't carry any bitterness toward him. He's 28, and he learned what he was taught. He learned that the truck matters, that the square footage matters, that a man's value lives somewhere in those numbers. He'll either figure out that's wrong, or he won't. That's his work to do, not mine. What I know is this. The things I've built in my life, the relationships, the trust, the honest work, none of them made noise while they were being built. They just accumulated, quietly, the way good things usually do. And when it mattered, they were there, solid, already done. I'm not telling the story because Douglas lost and I won. I'm telling it because I spent too many years at those Oakville dinner tables, feeling like I was missing something, like the man with the cracked rear window and the muddy boots had fallen behind somewhere and couldn't catch up. I believed it a little. I think I did. What my mother gave me wasn't money. It was confirmation of something I'd almost talked myself out of believing, that a life built on showing up honestly, on being someone people can count on when it's cold and inconvenient and there's no audience, that life is worth something, more than something. The cottage is still there. The dock my grandfather built is still holding. That's enough. That's more than enough.